They taught her to respect the badge. They never taught her how to survive a lie. The sound of the market in São Bento de Mar was a steady, living thing. Vendors calling prices for mangoes and queijo coalho, the clink of change, the low hum of a radio tuned to news from the capital. Morning light fell in strips through the canvas awnings of the feira, warming the wood stalls and the enamel mugs of caldo de cana. Ana Clara Oliveira walked through it the way she did everything, alert, measured, like a scanner quietly sweeping for inconsistencies. New gloves, new holster, the badge that had come with her transfer clip to her belt, all of it felt provisional, but real enough. Her father called when she stopped at Seu Antonio's stall to buy coffee. "How's the first week?" he asked. His voice was the same as always, tired, amused, full of small-town tolerance. He had worked at the town's radio for 30 years. He knew the names of every neighbor's children. They spoke for 3 minutes. He told her about the rain predicted for that afternoon, about a woman who wanted the police to look into a missing goat. And then, softer, he said, "Be careful with those men who think a name can buy them anything." She laughed and said she would. She wanted him to be calm. She wanted her uniform to be a shield he could lean on. The black pickup arrived an hour later, its engine a bass note of intrusion. It parked beside the bakery as if it owned that patch of air. Men in clean boots got out and scanned the market with the casual arrogance of entitlement. The son stepped down last, Victor Montenegro, thin, all teeth when he smiled, a haze of aftershave and certainty. He wore a shirt with his collar up, a watch bigger than a respectable man needed, and the posture of someone bred to be unchallenged. He saw Anna before most did. There are faces you remember because they refuse to move around you. He moved toward her like a tide. At first it was a comment, a line about being in the wrong place, about how certain women in uniform were better kept out of family matters. The vendors slid their gaze away. Anna kept her voice flat. "Sir, give me some space," she said. He mimicked her. He reached, clumsily, for the strap of her bag, as if to show her who could touch whom in public, as if the world would understand that touch as a right. The crowd contracted. Some stepped closer. A boy selling limes froze with a hand on his scale. Anna's hand came up reflexively. It was a small arc, palm to jaw, but it landed. The slap had a sound, a clean book slap against a face unaccustomed to the honest weight of consequence. Time thinned. There was the red bloom of Victor's cheek, the smear of his vanity, and a silence like a pressure change. Then murmurs, gasps, the clatter of a pannier dropped behind a table, somebody's shoes squeaking as they pivoted. Victor's face folded into astonishment, then fury. He touched his cheek with one hand and then, theatrically, placed that hand on his chest as if she had assaulted his very lineage. The pickup's men stepped forward. The market watched. Someone spat on the ground. A child laughed. Anna felt the heat at the back of her neck, the old adrenaline she had trained into utility. She kept her voice steady. "You harassed me," she said. "Leave her alone, and leave me alone." One of Victor's cronies muttered to him. Victor called out, voice reddening. "She struck me. The new delegate strikes the heir of Colonel Rogerio Montenegro." His words spilled outward like gasoline. By lunchtime, the market had split into factions. Those who kept close to Anna, a few neighbors she'd met buying permits and dealing with petty theft reports, and those who hurried to the shadow of the pickup. Speech passed through the town like a small contagion, and by 3 in the afternoon, a photograph appeared in the local tabloid that would mark the end of her introductory week. Jonas ran the newspaper. He ran it the way a man runs a lifeboat in choppy water, always watching the currents above and below. He had been the editor of the São Bento Gazette for 12 years, and his staples were survival and readers. The morning after the slap, Jonas sat at his desk with a red ink pen and a grin that was more survival instinct than cruelty. Someone from the Montenegro house had called him. There were concerns that the new delegate was using her position to extort and humiliate the town's rightful heirs. Jonas leaned into the story because the Montenegro name sold papers the way sugar sold coffee. The front page layout looked professional, like a crime report borrowed from a larger city. A photo of Anna in uniform cropped sharply, a headline in too bold font accusing her of aggression and extortion, and beneath it a staged caption suggesting she had demanded favors in exchange for leniency. The picture's mastery was in what it implied, not what it showed. Jonas cooled type as if cooling a bone. He knew to leave the rest to rumor. By 1542, the image had been circulating online, blurry and amplified by local WhatsApp groups.
By 1715, the corregidoria at the regional prefecture had a complaint on their desk, incandescent in formality, signed by a man who said he was Victor Montenegro. At 1810, in a voice that carried the weight of established channels, Anna's phone vibrated with the summons she knew would come first, an order to present herself at the corregidoria for preliminary administrative clarification. Her badge and service weapon were taken into custody. The words were exact, like the seal of an apparatus accustomed to protecting its own. They did it with efficiency, 2 officers reading her suspension letter with the polite coldness of training. Until the inquiry is concluded, you are relieved of active duties. Her holster was unlocked. A hand brushed her arm as the weapon was removed.
The town watched without watching. Some looked away as if shielding themselves. Some cheered. When she walked home that evening without her badge, the market looked different. A place where conversations now slid away from her with the speed of a tide drawing back. The radio in the corner shop played a samba she had danced to at 16. It sounded like a song in a different house. Her father was waiting on the porch, hands clasped as if to stop a tremor. He had seen the front page, a copy of the Gazette folded under a neighbor's arm like a weapon. "Are you all right?" she asked him. He tried to smile and failed. "The town speaks," he said. It was a small gestural phrase, the way fathers would not say everything their children needed to hear. That night, as the house kept its breath, the small town seemed to tilt under a new weight. He told her to sleep. He told her she had acted like a woman of honor. She lay awake beside him, the suspended badge of phantom on her mind. She had been trained to uphold order, to protect. There was a script for using force, a whole architecture of restraint and necessity, but no script for the sudden public humiliation of being made into a spectacle by those with resources to frame truth. Around midnight, the old radio in the kitchen shifted from local chatter to an update. The ministerial publico in the neighboring city had been notified of the events. Anna read the social feeds like triage, a mix of pity, outrage engineered by bots, and the brittle commentaries of local allies of the Montenegro family. At 1 in the morning, her father stood and went to the window to look at the plaza where he had sold transit advertisements for decades. He asked his daughter for a glass of water and told her not to worry about the radio. He read the paper for a while, the way a man reads the news to find where he stands in it. Then the kettle whistled somewhere in the house. He clutched his chest. Anna found him slumped against the chair, eyes open and used to listening. They called the ambulance. The EMTs came and moved through the room with the taste of old duty. They tried discipline, compressions, a defibrillator. The beeps in the hospital lit the night like an alarm clock for grief. He died at 3:33, after the doctors had worked into the dawn, a rhythm of professional attempts and polite defeat. The medical report would later cite a myocardial infarction. The town would speak about it in fragments, as people do when a loss is too sharp to hold. A man with a heart not ready for public shame. At the funeral, the town's rituals compressed into a single heavy day, rosaries muttered by the old women from church, floral arrangements that smelled of cheap carnations and sincere sorrow, whispers threaded with blame. Anna stood by the casket and said the words people expect at a grave. Her hands were steady, her face a map of a person who had learned to hold herself in public. Later, she walked the cemetery alone and pressed her palms into the cool earth where her father had been lowered. Grief changed her like a chemical. It did not surge wildly, it tuned. She felt nothing like vengeance in that moment. She felt the focus of a professional. Data, verification, and timelines. Honor, she had been taught, was not the applause of crowds. It was an inner calibration, a line you refused to let anyone redraw. The slap that had been seized and published was one slash of truth. The smear was methodical. That difference between inner honor and public reputation became a hinge. She would not leave the groove to which she was born. She had a career, she had principles, and she had a father who had died while the town gossiped. She closed her eyes and vowed something cold and precise, to reunite the facts so that they held together and could not be bent into someone's fiction. To that end, she would need witnesses, paper trails, and above all, an account that would not be easily paid off. For the first week after the funeral, she moved through the town like someone attending to a project. She returned the borrowed badge at the corregidoria and received a receipt stamped with the date,
July 6, 1821. She checked court calendars and administrative windows, learning the little habits of an apparatus that protected reputations with paperwork and delays. She bought a prepaid phone and a new SIM card in cash because anonymity in the beginning was a resource. These were small, legal choices, measures against the predictable surveillance of a town that belonged to a network. She found allies in unlikely places. Ramos was the first. He had been on the force for 29 years and had the kind of face that remembered apologies. He was near retirement and had a ledger of compromises balanced precariously. A son who owed money to a cousin for a motorcycle, a pension that looked smaller than his debts. Still, something in the way the market had turned on her touched him. He had never liked the Montenegro family. He had only liked the way they bought protection for themselves. He called her on a Wednesday with a voice like a man deciding to run across a busy street. "I can get you something," he said. "But you should know. That will cost me." She expected it. She accepted it. The cost was not money. It was the small, corrosive weight of doing right inside an institution that rewarded ambivalence. The evidence had to be assembled like a case in court. Pieces would sit on their own, but the whole needed to be contiguous. Timestamps stitching camera footage to phone calls, an audio recording with contour and context, a witness who would not be easily bought. The town's gossip was brittle. It broke under pressure. She began with the simplest, least risky asset: CCTV. São Antonio had a shop opposite the market. His camera was old, a grainy eye with a timestamp that rolled in the corner of the footage like a small, modest watch.
He was also the man who had sold Anna the coffee the morning she arrived. He had been watching market days for decades and had a ledger of favors he would call upon. When she went to him with a pen drive and a promise, he hesitated in the jacket of a man who had known how to hedge. "You understand if they come asking?" he said. His voice was the voice of the small businessman who had lived on both sides of the street. "I understand," Anna said. She left him a signed affidavit, a word he didn't understand fully, but which carried the solicitation of a formality that made him braver. He handed over a clip that had been recorded at 09:17:32 on June 28. The file name read CAM03 2024-06-28-091732.mp4. It was 17 seconds long, and grainy as it was, it showed a hand on Anna's shoulder, and then the clean arc of the slap. The feed contained ambient details, a child's lime vendor in the background, a female voice saying, "Now," that placed the event in the market and not in a manufactured photo studio. The timestamp matched a receipt from the bakery where a vendor claimed to have been there at 09:18 that morning. It was small, but it was a start. Next came the phone logs, which would be the more dangerous part. Ramos knew someone in the regional communications unit, a clerk with access to the records that the police kept for internal audits. Ramos's hand shook when he called the friend. He described the cost, a threat to retirement, a quiet conversation with a man who could make life complicated. The friend asked for details and a guarantee. Ramos promised he would be careful. He promised the one sort of currency that bureaucrats sometimes accept: plausible deniability. 3 days later, at 14:06 on July 3, Ramos slid a packet across Anna's kitchen table, printouts printed at the police station on secure paper. They were clean, stamped, and numbered. Each line read like a map of intent: numbers, durations, the rising brood of calls. One record showed a call at 09:28 on June 28 between a number registered under Secretaria Montenegro and the Gazette's newsroom contact, and then at 09:34, another call from that same number to a mobile registered to Victor Montenegro. The call durations matched: 00108, 00042, short, orchestrating bursts of conversation rather than long negotiations. The times aligned with the CCTV's timestamp. Anna set the printouts beside the video on her small kitchen table and breathed. The print quality and the secure paper were both risk and safety. They proved the log had been accessed through channels that could be audited and traced later. Ramos's access was not invisible. It was deliberate. He knew the cost. He knew his name could be attached to it. But he kept coming back because, he said once over coffee, "I don't want to live where a man can buy a name." The audio would be the hidden ace, the thing to unmask bragging and confession in the raw. It needed context. A voice can be dismissed as impersonation. A boast without anchoring moments can be shrugged off as drunken flirtation.
So Anna would need corroboration. The voice's cadence matched to known phrases, references to events only a participant would know, and the presence of a witness who could testify to the device's existence. Leo was 22 and worked shifts at the Rancho Dorado, the Montenegro family's country estate, where Victor and his friends drank and told stories. He was thin, with a face that tightened when the colonel's men came by the bar in suits. His gamble had been to accept small debts for big promises. Victor had once promised him a place in a construction job. Victor had laughed that laugh that meant nothing. When Anna approached Leo, it was not with threats. She came with a small envelope and a way out, money to pay a debt at the mechanic, and the chance for Leo to speak his conscience into something true. He did not want to put himself in harm's way, but he wanted to be more than the boy who drank at the bar. The recorder was small, already in his pocket, an object whose specifics I will not imagine in technical detail. It is enough that a device existed, and that his hands shook as he placed and then retrieved it. He gave the recorder to Anna in the alley behind his mother's grocery. He had a scar over his knuckle from a past fight, and he wiped it as if to remind himself of what he had paid. He told her everything he could recall: the room where Victor sat, the hour, approximately 23:10 on June 29, the smell of whiskey and cigars, a specific joke Victor made about how the town worked. The recorder's file read REC 2024-06-29-2311.wave, and was, once or twice through a player, rough and grainy. For 41 seconds, it held the edge of a laugh, a slurred confidence, and then Victor's voice, unmistakable to those who knew him, saying, "We pushed her out today. Jonas took it. The colonel paid to make it look clean. Her old man, he will fold." Then later he laughed and said, "No one will touch us. They all owe us." Voice recognition would be done by an independent journalist in the capital, someone whose reputation for verification was a currency in this town that money could not quite buy. The journalist would run the audio through a forensic test and note the spectral similarities, the idiosyncratic consonant stresses. The journalist would annotate the clip with timestamps and transcriptions. But that would be for the future. For now, Anna held the file in her hand like a hot coal. She knew, as any investigator does, that possession alone was not proof. Proof is a net, and a net must close without letting its seams be teased open by counterclaims. The week that followed was careful and dangerous. There were near misses, a patrol of Montenegro men at the market that lingered too long, a car that had a license plate Anna didn't recognize idling near the traffic circle for hours.
Jonas called her once and left a message in the language of threats, subtle, referencing old debts, and concluding with, "Be reasonable, delegate." She listened to the voicemail 3 times and later saved it to an encrypted folder. She would rather not confront him directly. Threats were part of a system that had rules. The town felt like a theater set where the script had been rewritten in the middle of the play. People who had greeted her politely in the market a fortnight before now counted their words like coins. Some closed doors. Some sent her messages of solidarity and month-old memes of heroism, social support that cost them nothing. Yet others crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Fear had its own gravity. Anna kept working. She met with a lawyer from the capital who specialized in press offenses and political corruption, and who asked 3 questions that revealed his competency: chain of custody, corroboration, and a plan for public diffusion that would not expose innocent sources. They spoke about handing materials to the Ministerio Público and to major outlets that would be harder to buy. The lawyer, a woman named Carla, said, "You can show it all to the public, Anna, but the procedural handoff is what gives it permanence. If you want them to act, you have to give it to the people who can't be paid off." Anna liked the directness of Carla's advice. The public, she knew, could be angry and helpful for a while, but institutions were the ones hardened by forms and truths. She started building both fronts. Ramos said one thing that stuck in her: "We can't win by shouting louder. We have to make the noise mean something." He daubed the words on a receipts book like a prayer for a civil servant. They established redundancies. The CCTV was copied twice. The phone logs were photographed with multiple angles on secure paper stamped with station letterhead so their provenance could be defended. Leo's recorder was placed into an evidence bag and signed by Anna and by a young paralegal she trusted at the public defender's office. Every movement they made was careful. Every hand that touched the materials left a trail.
The inevitability of paperwork steadied them. It was boring in a heroic way, the kind of bureaucracy that protects truth. Word began to leak, not the evidence itself, but the idea that something bigger was being assembled. A national reporter named Bruna, who had roots in the region and a reputation for taking through lines to the capital, called Anna asking for a comment. Anna told her nothing but suggested they meet in the city in a few days. The call was recorded, as it should be, a small professional ritual that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who knew how narratives hardened into inquiry. Not everyone stayed. Leo looked thinner when they met to hand over the recorder. His eyes were deeper hollows.
He said he had been called by someone from Rancho Dorado who had asked pointed questions about where he'd been that night. He said he slept badly and kept his phone off. He wanted the money he had been paid to be used for his mother's medicine. Anna gave him the envelope and told him to leave town if he wanted to. He considered it. He tapped his scar and did not answer at first. "I did what I could," he said finally. "I don't want to be remembered for one night. I want to be something else." Jonas, the editor, continued to run columns that painted Anna as reckless and a troublemaker. The Gazette's headline on July 9th read in bold, "Disgrace in Uniform." The editorial underneath was a carefully struck balance between outrage and the thin soup of plausible deniability. The Gazette ran a second piece that week, painting the Montenegro family as generous patrons of local progress. The contradictions would have been humorous if they had not been so effective. The pressure continued to build. The coronel's men were not simply thugs, they were institutional actors who used favor and fear with equal skill. Rogerio Montenegro, the coronel, did not appear in the market. He was a man who had been a visible power for decades, a patron of infrastructure projects, and a man who sat on boards and smiling photos. He had eyes in places Anna could not see. He had friends at the prefecture. Yet he had made enemies as well. Power had its fissures. In the dim light of Anna's kitchen one night, she let the pieces lie on the table like meat on a butcher's block. The video from São Antonio, the phone logs Ramos had printed, and the audio file. All of them were small things that together could make a shape. She could feel how close they were to being something irrevocable, a public accusation built on paper, sound, and image. Each piece alone was deniable. Together, they formed a way to map orchestrated defamation. "You don't have to do this alone," Ramos said, more softly than he had before. "There are people who will step forward when they see the truth out there, when they can't be paid to forget." She nodded. She had already done the hardest part, she thought. She had turned grief into a plan. But the plan required courage that felt like restraint in equal measure. She could have walked into the newsrooms like a woman scorned and demanded redress, but that was not the point. The point was to make the collection of evidence so publicly immutable that the apparatus could not simply tuck it into a drawer. She arranged a meeting with Bruna in the capital. She prepared folders. She printed clean copies of the files and stored duplicates with trusted people, a lawyer, a friend at the radio station that had been her father's workplace, and a national human rights group that specialized in press-protected evidence. The idea was simple and strategic. Make the materials available publicly while also providing prosecutorial policy to the Ministerio Público.
It was a dual path. The press would inflame the public and protect sources, while the prosecutors would have formal ground to open an investigation that could not be easily shelved. As she made these arrangements, the town watched and made its own assumptions. Some thought the national press would be a show and that the colonel would weather it with donations and an apology to the Gazette. Others felt a tremor of possibility. The small people who lived under the long reach of the Montenegro family, bar owners, farmers who accepted construction money, shifted slightly in their daily patterns. A woman at the bakery told Anna, quietly, that the colonel's men had been taking scores at the racetrack, that small sums had moved in certain men's pockets. It was the kind of anecdote that might be useful, the kind that waits for corroboration before becoming evidence. Days stretched into a mix of quiet preparation and acute anxiety. Jonas printed another editorial, a thinly veiled instruction to the town on how to be suspicious of outsiders. The Wikipedia of small-town politics is largely the same across places. Clientelism, favors repaid, grudges kept. Anna saw the architecture of it and read it like a blueprint.
At night, she sometimes dreamed of the slap in slow motion, watching the scene from above like an observer and feeling the weight of a hand that will not lift. In the dream, Victor's face would smear into a newspaper headline and then into her father's face. She woke up sweating and steadied herself with ritual: coffee, notes, lists of times and names. She was not yet ready to go public. The ace in her hand, Victor's recorded admission, needed corroboration and a platform that could not be easily bribed. She wanted an audience that would demand accountability beyond the town square. The national press was a risky ally, but an essential one. If the day came when she presented the materials, she would do so in a way that disclosed chain of custody, called for prosecutorial oversight, and left room for institutions to do their work. Someone will ask later why she didn't take more dramatic steps. The answer was simple. For Ana Clara, evidence was morality. It was also a survival tactic. The town's defenders had money and influence. They had curved institutions to their needs. Her only weapons were words that could be verified and media that would not accept a bribe. She chose them as a surgeon chooses instruments, because they were precise, not because they were quick. The week after Leo handed over the recorder, a local television crew from the state capital came through to do a human interest piece that had nothing to do with the Montenegro family. Bruna, the national reporter, contacted Ana with questions about logistics and suggested a meeting on the following Wednesday at 10 in the capital's press cafe. Ana accepted.
Before she left town, Ramos arranged one last formality, a notation in the police files that certain records had been accessed for a preliminary inquiry. It was a small administrative smear-proofing, a way to ensure that later things could be traced. The notation was typed and stamped. Access authorized for evidence preservation, requesting formal record of chain tracking. Agent Ramos, 07-11-1406. It was legal and bureaucratic in a way that made Ana think of hospitals and their insistence on signatures. It soothed her, absurdly. On Tuesday night, she packed a small bag. The town's air hung the same as ever. People set their chairs on the porch. Vendors tuned their radios. The world outside São Bento kept spinning. What changed was that a woman who had been publicly shamed now had proof kept in a modest briefcase: a pen drive, paper logs, a small audio file, and a paper trail of the people who had helped in their different moral currencies. She closed the case and ran her thumb along the edge. She thought of her father and took a breath that felt like the beginning of a plan that was legal, careful, and perhaps righteous. She was aware of the risk, of men who would try to intercept the briefcase on a road, of editors who would sell the story to the highest bidder, of judges who would move slowly. She was also aware of another thing. The public has its own law. When enough people see the same thing, when they hear the same voice, the fortress of power finds itself under a new kind of pressure. Behind her, the town went on. A child haggled for a toy in the market, an elderly woman tended her plants, and Jonas folded another edition of the Gazette. Within the small, deliberate world Ana had been given, one fact remained. She had been suspended, her honor muddied in print, and the colonel's name cast its long shadow. Yet she held a card, grainy, imperfect, but undeniable, that could redraw the ledger. If you want to see how one woman fights an entire town, stay with us. On the train to the capital she worked. She arranged the sequence in her head. Show the CCTV first to fix the market scene in the public imagination. Present the phone logs to prove orchestration. Then, carefully, end with the audio, the confession, backed by chain of custody evidence and a corroborating independent forensic analysis. Bruna had insisted on this order. She was the reporter who understood how to build a narrative that prosecutors could also use. She would film the footage, take notes, and provide the national amplification that local money could not easily bribe. The city moved differently. Wider streets, a different cadence to the newsrooms. Bruna met her in a cafe between two glass towers, carrying a small recorder and the weight of a journalist who had seen similar plays elsewhere. She listened to Ana's outline without interjection.
She asked practical questions about tape file names, upload backups, and whether backups could be stored off-site, not to give technical instruction, but to verify that Ana had thought systematically. She wanted the files to be irrefutably tied to dates, to locations, to witnesses. "You come in with evidence," Bruna said, "and we come in with reach. You give it to the public and to the Ministerio Público. We make the initial waves, so prosecutors have to react. If what you have is solid, they'll open a formal inquiry. If not, they'll have to explain why not." It was the map Ana needed. They planned a preliminary release to the press contingent, not a broadcast,
a staged presentation with documentation. Bruna made notes. She would call a forensic audio lab, have the clip analyzed, and take a notarized copy to a lawyer who worked at a national transparency NGO. Ana would bring the original devices and the signed evidence back. It was clear, professional, and slow enough to be safe. Back in São Bento, the rumor had a life of its own. Rancho Dorado's gates had men watching for cars that didn't belong. A courier delivered a bottle of wine to Jonas's house with a note that had no signature. Ana's mother watched the market from the kitchen window with a towel in her hands. She had been polite to those who came around selling sympathy. She had called Ana twice to tell her that the radio station had a man who would back her, quietly. The weekend before the planned meeting with the national reporter, someone tore up the poster at the local youth center that had Ana's photo on it and scrawled a threat in spray paint. She filed the complaint with the municipal authority. A report was made in the log at 12:44 on the Monday. It was petty but symbolic, a signal that some corners of the town would not be neutral. When Ana arrived on the morning Bruna had suggested, she carried the given items in a non-flashy bag and sat with the posture of someone who had seen too many late nights to be surprised. She watched Bruna on her phone as she typed updates for contacts in Brasilia. They both understood that the coming days would be more than a story. They would be a test of whether a public could hold powerful men to account. She had no illusions. The colonel's influence might blunt the edge of any immediate action. He could press favors and ask for delays. But in this game, delays were vulnerabilities. Time was a material in which pressure worked. The more Ana could move the narrative into national light, the more likely it was that outside institutions, ministries, national broadcasters, and prosecutors would be forced to respond. She was ready to hand over the files to people who could authenticate them. She was also ready to watch them be challenged. Preparedness felt better than fury. It felt like strategy. The postponement of justice had been a long machinery in São Bento.
It had an engine of small kindnesses and favors, of polite concessions in municipal meetings, of the soft contacts of men with influence. Ana had learned to read that engine like a stethoscope. Now she intended to place her hand on the hood and listen for the precise clicks. In the evening after the meeting, she wrote an email that she would later forward to Ramos, the list of actions, the names of witnesses, and the steps that would need to be taken if the press moved forward. She included a clause for formal submission to the Ministerio Público and a plan to keep multiple copies of the files off-site. She closed her laptop and looked at the sky over the capital. It was the kind of sky that made promises seem both possible and costly. She slept poorly that night. Her dreams were not of revenge but of process, chains of custody, signatures, and men having to explain themselves under lights and microphones. She awoke with a thin sense of something like anticipation. She had done the work to make the case not only visible but verifiable. Returning to São Bento felt to her like stepping into a room where the air had already changed pitch. Small things registered first. The bakery worker who used to joke about his daughter's hair no longer met her eyes. The municipal notice board carried a new yellowed flyer calling for calm. The plaza's pigeon population had been disturbed by too many boots. The town had adjusted to a rumor and was now living in it. She kept her schedule disciplined. Mornings she spent at the radio station where her father had worked, filing copies of the files with a technician named Marta who owed him a favor. Marta took a photo of every document on a camera with a visible timestamp, 07/14/2024, 09/02, anafiles.jpg, and saved duplicates to a cloud account registered to a transparency NGO's email. Ana recorded who touched each file. The evidence bag containing Leo's recorder had been signed by her, by a paralegal named Daniel from the public defender's office, and by a notary who recorded the chain. Evid bag 001, received 07/12/2024, 16:37, custodian, Ana Clara Oliveira. Each signature was a small, legal bolt. Ramos, despite the risk, moved with the slow decency of someone who had decided to unlearn indifference. He began keeping a log of who requested what at the station, noting names and times in a book labeled Access Register, Preliminary Preservation. On July 11th at 14:06, he had typed and stamped the notation that would later help defend the origin of the logs. Records accessed for evidentiary preservation under agent oversight. He left the book open on his desk like a witness. It made him nervous to do it, but it also made him feel honest. The colonel's circles did not sleep. Rogelio Montenegro sat in a living room whose upholstery had been replaced twice during his tenure, a man whose photographs with mayors and ministers lined the walls.
He drank black coffee and felt the irritation of entropy. A local slap had leaked a fault line his name could not entirely conceal. He called Jonas twice in the morning, one call at 09:15, another at 11:03, and the editor's voice on the voicemail bore both deference and panic. "Keep it tight," Rogerio said. "Push the new delegate angle. Delay anything that looks like formal evidence." His legal team began to draft motions and to look for ways to file counterclaims of defamation.
Jonas, meanwhile, received a memo from the Gazette's biggest advertiser, the construction company that had benefited from Montenegro contracts. The memo suggested a soft editorial recalibration. He sat in his office and looked at the paper money that kept his presses working. Survival and ethics were not aligned, and he had spent his career learning which to choose. For now, he chose the side that bought ink. On July 15th, Bruna arrived with a small team, a camera operator, a veteran reporter, and a producer from a national outlet that had done investigative pieces before. Her presence changed the chemistry of São Bento. She brought with her the name of a forensic lab in the capital, a phone number to a lawyer in the Ministério Público, and the momentum of media reach. She and Ana met in the town square for 20 minutes to cross-check lists, then moved to the hotel where the conference would be staged. The hotel choice was deliberate. Hotel Central's ballroom sat neutral between the colonel's estate and the municipal hall. It was a place where neither side had home advantage. Bruna had called ahead and reserved a modest stage, ordered extra security through her outlet, and invited 2 national broadcasters and a legal correspondent from a daily paper. She also sent a sealed digital package to a forensic audio lab with a note: request expedited analysis and a notarized report. Files CAM 03 2024 06 28 09 17 32.mp4, Rec 2024 06 29 23 11.wave. Phone logs Ramos print 07 03 14 06.pdf. Please verify provenance and voice signature. The lab acknowledged receipt with a tracking code and an estimated turnaround time, 48 to 72 hours. They planned the order and the handoffs like a surgical team: video, phone, audio, then formal submission to the Ministério Público. The press event would be filmed by the national networks and live-streamed by Bruna's outlet, creating a public record harder to spin or buy. Every move had to be defended. Every step required redundancy. Ana made copies of the CCTV clip onto 2 separate encrypted drives and left one copy with Carla, her lawyer in the capital, who placed it in a locked safe and logged it as Safe 01 Copy A, received 07-15-2024-1922. Marta at the radio station kept the cloud backup she had made under a password known only to 3 people. Daniel the paralegal kept a thumb drive physically locked in the public defender's office with a signed receipt.
The recorder, Leo's device, remained in its evidence bag in a municipal safe until Bruna could arrange pickup by the forensic team. Not everyone liked the plan. At the table in a small bakery, an elderly man warned Ana about the cost of making enemies out of men who never forgave. A cousin of Ramos's called and asked if there might be other ways to avoid a fallout. Ana answered with the bluntness of someone who had measured her options. The cost of silence had already been paid. The forensic audio lab called back 2 days later. The analyst, an engineer, used tempered language that made technical conclusions feel weightier. There is strong probabilistic matching between your sample and reference voice prints, she said. Idiosyncratic sibilance and the spectral envelope align with verified samples of Victor Montenegro's voice. Further contextual corroboration is recommended. File integrity shows no obvious edits in the segment we analyzed. Bruna took notes and asked for a signed letter and a report on their methods. The lab obliged with a notarized report delivered under return receipt. On the morning of the public presentation, the hotel ballroom filled with a specific kind of tension: camera lenses, microphones, a few dozen chairs for invited local citizens and national press. Ana wore civilian clothes under a blazer to look like a woman who had been stripped of uniform but not authority. She had rehearsed how she would speak with Bruna and Carla. Clear statements, no accusations framed as verdicts, a legal handoff that would protect sources. The event would be a staged handover: show the material publicly, then present originals and chain of custody documents to representatives of the Ministério Público and to the national outlets. It was designed to convert outrage into formal action. Victor Montenegro's image flicked across the hotel's parked televisions that morning. The family had called a private lawyer and issued a terse statement denying orchestration while promising to fight misinformation. Rogerio placed a call to a senator he knew, asking for counsel. He did not sleep well the night before. Power's slow erosion is a noise that can keep a man awake. The press conference began at 11 on July 18. Bruna opened with a short introduction, the context of a suspended officer, the accusations against the Montenegro Circle, and the presence of corroborating materials. She explained the sequence they would present: CCTV followed by call logs and finally the audio clip, and she emphasized that the materials had been submitted to the Ministério Público. Ana spoke last. Her voice in the microphone was measured and precise. She began by acknowledging the town's sorrow, the death of her father, and the vulnerability she felt. "My purpose here is not to humiliate a family," she said. "It is to make sure the record is true. These materials have been preserved following legal procedures. They will be handed over to the Ministério Público."
I ask that the town and the country judge us by facts rather than whispers. Bruna cued the first clip. The CCTV played for 17 seconds on a large screen. Cam 03, 2024, 06, 28, 09, 1732. The image was grainy but unmistakable. The tape's timestamp flashed in the corner, 2024, 06, 28, 09, 1732. Viewers could see the pickup by the bakery, the cluster of market stalls, the hand on Anna's shoulder, and then the motion that landed the slap. There was no theatricality. The video captured the action as a plain fact. Sound from the feed, thin and raw, included a woman's "no" and the clack of a dropped basket. Cameras in the room recorded as national networks cut to live feeds. Next, Bruna laid out the phone logs. Slides showed a sequence of calls. Secretaria Montenegro to Gazette Newsroom, 06, 28, 2024, 09, 28, 00, 108. Then Secretaria Montenegro to Vitor Montenegro Mobile, 06, 28, 2024, 09, 34, 00, 042. The slide also included photocopies of printouts on secure station paper bearing stamps that matched Ramos's access notation. Accessed 07, 03, 2024, 1406. Station secure print. Carla stood up and explained in civil terms that the log suggested a pattern of communication consistent with coordination, not coincidence. A legal correspondent in the room asked about whether the phone numbers had been registered under official names. Ramos answered publicly that the numbers traced back to offices within the Montenegro administrative apparatus and internal contacts at the Gazette. Then the audio played. The WAV file was not slick. It began with the clatter of ice in a glass and a soft laugh, and then Vitor's voice, unmistakable to those who knew him by tone and habit, said words that devastated curated stories. "We pushed her out today. Jonas took it. The colonel paid to make it look clean. Her old man, he will fold." The second sentence landed like a verdict in a room already tired of polite evasion. The broadcasted clip was 41 seconds long. Bruna had arranged for the clip to include both the boast and the contextual laughter around it. The audio's graininess was the opposite of an impediment. It sounded like a man caught in the casual vanity of his own truths. Bruna then described the forensic lab's findings without grandstanding. The lab's report noted a strong match between the recording and reference samples, and no signs of splicing or manufactured edits were detected within the excerpt analyzed. She provided the lab's notarized letter to the camera and handed the original evidence bag to a representative of the Ministerio Publica who had arrived as a listener and who accepted the bag with a formal receipt. Ministerio Publica, evidence received, 07-18-2024, Agent Dr. Helena Moreira. The public handoff was essential. It meant that the materials were now in the custody of an institution with statutory authority to investigate. Reactions in the room were immediate and visible. The local editor, Jonas, sat pale.
He exchanged a look with a man he had long considered a patron, and then, under pressure and cameras, stood to give a statement that promised cooperation while declining to accept wrongdoing. "All outlets must be careful with claims," he said, voice shaking. "We will cooperate with investigators." His words, earnest or practiced, were now on public record. Outside, social media combustion began to build. Bruna's outlet streamed the footage and filed an article within the hour. A hashtag trended regionally, #WhoPaysForPower. The national broadcaster cut to legal experts who explained that the handoff made a formal inquiry likely and that a forensic match would provide grounds for at least preliminary charges to examine. Back in the town, the effect was raw. Groups gathered at the bar, on porches, and outside the plaza. Some cheered. Many listened. A woman at the bakery cried quietly as she watched a live feed on her phone. Men who had once waved to the Montenegro trucks now looked worried, as if they had seen the weather shift and suspected the flood might be coming. Rogerio Montenegro reacted as men of power often do, with a mix of legalism and expedience. He fired a lawyer who had advised quiet settlement and hired a team to respond aggressively, arguing chain of custody irregularities and potently questioning motives. He issued a statement via his counsel accusing the press of sensationalism and threatening to file suit for defamation. He called friends in the prefecture to inquire about procedural timelines and whether the Ministerio Publico might be persuaded to slow its release of findings. Those calls were documented in later probes as evidence of an attempt to influence administrative timelines. The Ministerio Publico, however, did not back away. Dr. Helena Moreira, the prosecutor who accepted the bag, read the documents with a meticulous face, and then, in a procedural move that kept the institution's integrity intact, announced that a formal inquiry would be opened and that members of the public could provide testimony. She set an initial deadline for witness submissions and ordered a secure chain of custody protocol for the original files. The announcement was measured. "These materials will undergo due process. We will investigate allegations thoroughly," she said into the microphones. The statement did not convict anyone, but it placed the matter under legal scrutiny no local influence could easily sweep aside. In the days that followed, investigators from the capital visited São Bento. They interviewed São Antonio and recorded his statement about the CCTV clip. They took the original files to their labs for additional analyses and issued a request to the Gazette for internal communications between the newsroom and the Montenegro administrative number. They issued precautionary orders to protect witnesses, including Leo and Marta.
At dawn on July 20, federal police agents arrived and accompanied local officers to execute a search warrant at the Gazette's offices and to take Jonas in for questioning. He was not arrested on those grounds, but detained for interrogation about the chain of commissioning the front-page image and any payments received from third parties. Arrests unfolded carefully and with legalese. 2 men who had been identified as having placed payments to local intermediaries were detained for questioning on charges of complicity in obstructing public duty, a technical process, not a final judgment. The colonel's lawyer went to court to argue for delay and claimed political persecution. The legal machinery churned, slow and relentless. Ana watched as the town's long-held habits of influence were exposed to bureaucratic light. The public fallout was messy and immediate. Contracts tied to Montenegro projects were re-examined. A local contractor in possession of receipts for consulting payments became a source of new questions. Some citizens who had once taken small favors now asked for receipts and asked municipal clerks for project justifications. The bar where the colonel's men had measured favors now had quieter conversations and a new, uneasy civility. Not everyone found solace in the exposure. Leo was terrified. He slept with a friend on the outskirts of town for several nights. Ana arranged for him to be included in the witness protection measures the prosecutors could provide, relocation for a short period, and a promise of anonymity in the hearing transcripts. He left town on a bus with a duffel bag and a heavy face, carrying the knowledge that his cooperation had changed the course of many lives. He had paid a price, fear, shame, and a loss of the place he had known, but he had also purchased another commodity, a sense of self beyond being a passive actor in someone else's story. For Ramos, the risk was practical. He received an internal notice that his access to certain databases would be audited. He knew potential retaliation could come in procedural ways, delayed promotions, forced retirement. The station's chief approached him with offers written as concern and veiled threats. Move on quietly, they suggested implicitly. Ramos came to Ana one evening and rubbed his forehead like a man holding a fresh ache. "They can make your life very small with paperwork," he said, "but you did the right thing." He meant the sentiment to comfort himself as much as her. The colonel's network pushed back in different ways. A series of counter-narratives began to circulate, that Ana had staged evidence, that Leo had lied for money, that the forensic lab was biased. Jonas's defense argued that the footage could have been misinterpreted and that a single audio fragment did not equate to a conspiratorial campaign. These narratives found echo among some who feared the destabilization of a system that had kept their livelihoods predictable.
But each counterclaim had to stand against the forensic reports, the timestamps, and the notarized receipts. Public pressure mattered. National commentators began to treat the case as emblematic of broader problems: local clientelism, media capture, and the way reputations could be engineered. NGOs sent observers. The Ministerio Público received more witness statements from people who had been afraid to speak earlier. The archives at the construction company were subpoenaed. A trail of invoices that looked like consulting fees became part of an audit. Each step was provisional. No one promised convictions, but each action made the arena of influence less private and more public. On July 25th, Ana received a notice in the mail. Her suspension had been reviewed and a formal administrative hearing was scheduled. The hearing would determine whether her suspension remained or whether she could return to active duty pending the outcome. Her hands shook when she read the envelope. She had not gone into the fight seeking reinstatement as a vindictive balm. She sought simply the restoration of her official capacity so she might continue to pursue leads with institutional support. The badge had been more than metal. It had been a method and a jurisdiction. She showed up at the hearing flanked by Carla and by a representative from the National Journalists Association, who came to ensure press freedom standards were respected. Dr. Elena Moreira attended to provide a procedural update, not as an advocate, but as a custodian of evidence. The hearing did not resemble a courtroom drama. It was technical: papers, sworn statements, and procedural debate. A line of municipal officers testified about their knowing interactions with the Gazette. A clerk produced an old email chain hinting at editorial influence. Jonas testified. His answers were tight and often non-committal. When the panel rendered its interim decision, it was careful in its wording. Anna's suspension would be lifted pending the ongoing inquiry, and temporary measures would be taken to prevent retaliation against witnesses. The language specified conditions and noted that formal charges had not been issued. It emphasized the need for institutional impartiality. The badge was returned with a receipt. Badge return 07-26-2024, 1517. The holster felt like a small, ordinary miracle on her hip. She did not celebrate loudly. She sat on the bench outside the hearing room and held the medal for a long time. It was heavy with both grief and a new practical weight. Her reinstatement did not mean everything is fixed. Legal battles would likely take months or years. Evidence could still be contested. Jonas could appeal. Ruggiero could deploy political resources. But the reinstitutionalization of her role created a legitimate pathway for investigation that could proceed without the question, at least for now, of whether she had the authority to follow leads.
The town's atmosphere shifted further after the hearing. Some neighbors offered shy congratulations. Marta at the radio station played one of the national segments and read comments from listeners who said they wanted fairness. The bar where old cronies drank had new patrons who asked different questions. Little changes aggregated into a new public routine. In private, Anna felt the cost. Her father's absence remained a hollow that ceremony could not bridge. She went back to his grave one afternoon, sat on the cool earth, and laid the badge beside the stone. She told him, softly, about the conference and about the lab's letter and about how a boy had made a brave choice. She told him she had done what she could with the tools he had helped her value: evidence, patience, and a refusal to surrender honor for safety. She did not say that it had been easy. She did not say that the scars of the publicity were gone. She simply spoke the facts she wished he could hear. The legal process continued. Preliminary charges were considered, inquiries widened from the local gazette to include potential contractors and a municipal clerk who had been recorded accepting envelopes. Arrests as formal orders and indictments were not instantaneous. What followed were days of lawyers filing motions, expert witnesses being consulted, and procedural front-loading that consumed time. The court docket filled with motions to preserve evidence, to request audits of the town's public works accounts, and to subpoena bank records. The speed of judicial review was not vindictive. It was procedural and slow, and it required patience. Public reaction, meanwhile, sustained the pressure. Stories on morning programs framed the São Bento saga as a case study in how small towns can be captured by elites, and how a single person's persistence can force institutions to act. Civic groups convened panels on municipal transparency. Students at the local high school organized a march demanding clearer procurement procedures. The political ripple was real, without promising a full sweep of justice overnight. There were moments of human tenderness amid the procedural churn. A man who had once sold tickets at the racetrack came forward with a receipt that implicated a minor contractor. He apologized publicly for his silence in the past and offered his statement to prosecutors. A woman who cleaned at the Gazette said she had overheard conversations about arranging stories and provided sworn testimony about meetings. Their motives were mixed: guilt, fear, self-preservation. But their contributions added up. The case now had a social dimension. People began to feel safer speaking because the cost of silence had become visible. Ramos, too, felt the consequences. He began the process of documenting possible retaliation. Someone attempted to delay his pension paperwork. A rumor suggested disciplinary measures.
He laughed once, a thin, exhausted sound, and said, "I worked 30 years to get to the place where I could choose who to be. I can live with the price." His family, children who needed education and stability, watched, and he watched them. Courage, he learned, often has domestic collateral. The colonel's circle frayed, but did not snap. Ruggiero remained a figure of property and influence. He withdrew somewhat from public events and watched the docketed dates with a lawyerly curiosity. The legal firm he hired filed motions to challenge the validity of certain printouts and questioned the linkage of incoming calls. They requested delays for depositions. The process was, in many ways, how power fights, by making time an ally, hoping for mistakes, and using the annoy of prolonged procedure to lessen energy. But public scrutiny,
media attention, and a growing stack of corroborated evidence made delay an increasingly risky strategy. Months passed in a cadence of waiting. Witnesses were scheduled, forensic reports continued to trickle into the record, and the public conversation kept recentering on São Bento. There were bruises, threats on social media, an attempt to discredit Marta's technical competence, a break-in at a municipal clerk's home that looked more like intimidation than theft. Protective measures were scaled up, but there were also clear institutional signs of movement: audits of municipal contracting, inquiries into the Gazette's finances, and the Ministerio Público's formal registration of a multi-party probe. The final public image in this phase of the story was not triumphant fireworks, but quiet, recovered authority. Ana went to the station on a weekday morning, walked through the market with the badge on her belt, and saw people nod in different manners. A teenager who once refused to speak to her because his family feared the Montenegro family now said hello. The municipal clerk, who had been hired because of patronage, came to the station to give a recorded statement. These small shifts mattered because they signaled that the town's default had been interrupted. Ana's reinstatement was not a coronation. At the police station, a senior officer did a cursory inspection of her files and handed back the holster with procedural wording that made small talk of procedure sound large. "We restore your duties pending legal determination. Cooperate with investigations as needed." She signed forms. She walked out and held the badge in her palm in the courtyard where pigeons had returned but flew easier now. The badge did not erase the ache of her father's empty chair at the radio's control panel, and it did not guarantee closure, but it did give her the necessary jurisdiction to continue. The investigation was still ongoing as the town adjusted. Some pieces of evidence were strong, others were contested.
Prosecutors announced in a public forum that further steps would be taken and that they were pursuing financial records and summoning additional witnesses. The legal horizon was realistic. Trials, appeals, and the unpredictability of legal determinations loomed. No one promised a full sweep tomorrow. What Ana tapped, finally, was something that mirrored the title that had stung her for weeks. Her honor, publicly smeared by a coordinated campaign, had been partially restored, not by revenge, but by the slow, meticulous application of evidence, procedure, and public oversight. The hidden ace, the audio confession, had been the pivot, because it had given human voice to a plan previously dismissed as rumor. That clip, combined with the CCTV and the logs, was the hinge that transformed a market slap into an institutional question about abuse of power. She also kept the cost. The price had been the private grief of her father's death and the public cost of living under scrutiny. Leo left town and carried his own burden. Ramos ceded some peace for the sake of truth. Jonas's reputation was raked in a courtroom of public scrutiny. Rogerio's reach had been checked, for now, though not erased. In the weeks after the major public reveal, Ana found herself alone one evening in the plaza where the market tables folded and the lamps came on. She touched the cool metal of the badge and felt the weight of procedure, of rhetoric, of small-town intimacy. She thought about how honor differs from reputation. One measures the internal line of doing right. The other is a fragile social construct that can be bent into unrecognizability. She felt both the bitterness of the smear and the cool satisfaction of process. The town's future remained uncertain. Legal hearings were scheduled. The Ministerio Público had prepared indictments for review. Audits would test the depth of financial entanglement. The movement from rumor to public inquiry was not a full victory. It was a conversion of private power into public question. The work ahead would be procedural, slow, and necessary. Ana walked home that night past the bakery. A boy selling limes called out to her by name, in a voice that thanked her without ceremony. The radio at the corner shop played a song her father had loved, the same samba that had sounded like a song in another house months ago. She lifted her face to the warm window light, held the badge close for a moment, and then set it back on the nightstand. She had done this to honor the truth and the memory of the man who had once manned a microphone and taught her how to listen. When national press and prosecutors declared a formal inquiry, when Leo's statement was included under protective measures, when Marta's cloud backup was logged into the case file, those were all parts of the same mechanism that made the powerful accountable. They were not airtight guarantees. They were not immediate convictions.
They were slow, paper-heavy, human steps toward a process that some would see as justice and others would grumble at as an uncomfortable scrutiny. In a final act of procedure, Ana delivered a binder to the ministerial publico's office labeled Complete Preservation, São Bento Inquiry. It contained pages, photographs, notarized receipts, timestamps, transcripts of Bruna's recorded interviews, and the chain of custody forms signed by witnesses and witnesses' lawyers. Dr. Elena Moreira received the binder and placed it on a desk that had seen many such heavy things. "We will proceed according to the law," she said quietly. It was not a promise of instant resolution. It was the guarantee of institutional process. The town continued its rhythms, but with a new awareness that power could be questioned, and that sometimes an ordinary person with a badge and a stubborn commitment to evidence could create openings for accountability. For Ana Clara, the victory was precise and partial. It rebalanced her public honor, but left the personal pain intact. It gave her, however, an official pathway to continue working on behalf of a town that now would be tested for its willingness to demand transparency. She stood in the plaza one last time before leaving for a night shift. The market lights hung like a small city's stars. A couple argued about the price of mangoes. A child chased a pigeon and stumbled into laughter. Ana placed a small picture of her father, one he had worn on his radio booth, into her wallet. She felt the presence of the man who had told her to be careful with those who thought a name could buy anything. She felt the person she had become, a detective who had been suspended, whose honor had been publicly challenged, and who had, by method and law, converted a hidden ace into a public question. She turned to leave. The badge sat against her hip, steady and real. The fight would continue in courtrooms and in municipal offices, and in the private decisions that people in São Bento would make about how to do business. Justice in its full measure might take seasons. But what she had achieved was the making of an account that could not be easily erased. Names tied to times, voices matched to files, and a prosecutor holding a binder stamped with a date. She walked into the night with that small, durable thing, an anchor of procedure, and the quiet knowledge that keeping faith with truth sometimes costs everything, and sometimes, finally, returns the smallest but most important thing: honor. If this story moved you, subscribe and share, and tell us in the comments about a time your community had to choose truth over convenience.